Hello, with me today is Dr. Harith bin Ramli, who is an expert in Islamic studies. And I'm sure that in virtually every news bulletin you're hearing of the Sunni and the Shi'a and the differences between them. But apart from being names, is there any way that we can have a sense of the differences between Sunni and Shia Islam? And this is the question that Harith is going to address for us. Harith, you've got about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Can you take us from zero to knowing something on the differences between Sunni and Shia Islam?
I'll try my best.
Okay.
Well, the first thing to know is that generally speaking, the two traditions are fairly diverse. You know, within Sunni Islam, there are many schools of law, schools of theology. Within Shia Islam, there are several different branches with their own theological methods and approaches. But also one has to add that there's a fair amount of tolerance between the two over the, over the medieval Islamic period. Sunnis and Shias have, differed but have tolerated each other and lived together, without finding those theological differences a reason to fight one another constantly. The basic difference is really over the succession to the Prophet Muhammad, the early events, what happened after the Prophet Muhammad died, who was to succeed him, and also the nature of that leadership. What kind of person has to be the leader of the Muslim community after the Prophet is gone? And I suppose I should add that all Sunnis and Shias broadly agree that the Prophet is the final messenger to mankind. So there's no question about prophecy. The question is more what kind of leader needs to take over the Muslim community after the Prophet Muhammad has died.
So it is the grandson of the Prophet that leads to the division, isn't it?
Yes, the focus is really on the figure of Ali bin Abu Talib, who is the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad. He's also the Prophet's son-in-law. And the grandson you refer to is Hussein. He marries the Prophet's daughter Fatima, and they have two sons, Hassan and Hussein. And the cutoff point, I guess, as you pointed out, is the killing of Hussein. But I think we need to go back to the early events, basically.
Okay.
So, according to Sunnis, the Prophet designated Abu Bakr, his very close companion, who accompanied him when he migrated from Mecca to Medina, Abu Bakr, as the prayer leader of the Muslim community right before his death. So when he was on his deathbed, Abu Bakr was leading the prayers. And this kind of indicated that Abu Bakr had some special status and should have been the leader. Shias say that he identified Ali, his cousin and son-in-law, as the successor to the Muslim community very clearly. So there's a difference of kind of narratives of, who should be the successor.
So in the distinction between Sunni and Shia, we have this very common distinction we find in religious traditions. Each of them has their own vision of history. There's two versions of history.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's take us through the Sunni version of history now, and then we can get here. So what's the Sunni version?
Okay. So the Sunni version says that there are two types of Sunni version. One states that Muhammad made it very clear that his friend was to be the leader of the community by indicating that he should have been the prayer leader when Muhammad was too ill to kind of lead them during the prayers at the mosque. Another kind of, I guess one could also say, the Sunnis also basically said that the Prophet didn't appoint anyone in particular but left it to the community to decide by consensus. So according to the Sunni accounts, after the Prophet's death, there was a meeting that took place between all the leading figures of the Muslim community, and they kind of came to an agreement upon Abu Bakr. So there's no disagreement. According to the Sunni perspective, everyone was happy with the choice of Abu Bakr.
And then from Abu Bakr, there is a succession onwards where the community appoints and appoints and appoints.
Yes.
Okay. Now take us through the Shia version.
According to the Shia version, the Prophet makes it very clear when he goes on his final pilgrimage to Mecca, and he comes back and he kind of gathers together his followers and he says, Ali is going to be my successor. Anyone who considers me to be their guardian, their protector, they should consider Ali their guardian and protector. And there are some Sunni traditions that accept this, but they interpret this verse slightly differently, this tradition slightly differently. But for the Shi'as, this was a very clear indication that Ali was to succeed. So hence when, the group of Muslims gathered together and appointed Abu Bakr as the leader, essentially these people were usurpers of the true candidate for leadership.
Okay.
Ali.
So there's a claim, so there is one of these famous disputes, which side is genuine?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And then Ali, how does that move on? Because I know that Karbala comes in.
Yes, Karbala is very important. She is commemorated every year. Well, basically what happens is Ali does eventually become the fourth caliph. Even from the Sunni perspective, Ali is the legitimate fourth caliph. But his caliphate is plagued by, firstly, members of the family of the previous caliph who was assassinated, so they're not happy. They thought that Ali took the leadership too quickly without trying to resolve who killed the previous caliph. And also soldiers who basically broke away from Ali's camp because he made too many compromises with his enemies. So eventually the family of the third caliph, Uthman, they're led by a guy called Muawiyah. They eventually take over the caliphate after Ali. And Ali's two sons, he has two sons, one Hassan and one Hussein. Hassan basically makes an agreement with the Umayyads. He says, he doesn't need to be the leader. That's fine. But when he passes away, his brother Hussein, many people look towards him to be the successor. And that's partly because the reigning caliph, Umayyad caliph at the time, is a guy called Yazid, who's well known for not being very moral. Some people say he was a drunk as well. So Hussein went to Iraq from Medina, where he was living, and this threatened the Umayyads. And they sent down a force of soldiers, and perhaps this was a misunderstanding, but whatever it was, it led to a massacre, essentially, of members of the Prophet's household, namely Hussein. These Umayyad forces took his head back to Damascus, which was the capital of the Umayyads at the time. And this event basically is marked by Shi'is as kind of the black dot that initiates this period of injustice in Islamic history, which they need to remember and commemorate, to remind themselves that the true leadership of Islam isn't really in the rightful hands, which is the family of the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay, so that's the origins and the different stories of the origins. Now, you mentioned at the beginning that there are different ways of doing theology, a Sunni way of doing theology and a Shia way of doing theology. Could you illustrate that for us? Okay,
so broadly speaking, the theological differences are minor in many areas other than the question of leadership. The approach in doing theology becomes different because essentially what happens is the Shi'is favor only the people who sided with Ali during these events, and further on, with the succeeding generations, members of Ali's family. So anyone who doesn't side with them, they kind of denounce as heretics. So what happens is the reporting of traditions becomes very important, and any tradition or teaching that is not passed down through this very small group of supporters of Ali, these are kind of rejected, more or less. Whereas for the Sunnis, they basically say, well, all the early companions of the Prophet, they might have had their disagreements, but we accept them because they were close to the Prophet. So for the Sunnis, they would accept any tradition that's passed down by anyone from that generation, whereas for the Shi'is, they take a more restricted view of what the actual authentic tradition of Islam is. It also differs on how they view leadership. The Sunnis kind of settle on a much more, one could say, pragmatic view of leadership, where the caliph is essentially the guy who reigns, who, as long as he upholds the law, it doesn't have to be the best person of his time. He has to fulfill certain criteria, but essentially if he keeps the social order, he's recognized as the authority, as a leader. Whereas for the Shi'is, the leader has to be someone from that very particular lineage, descended from Ali and the Prophet's daughter Fatima, and he in fact has to have certain qualities of infallibility, because the Shi'is argue that God wouldn't leave the community without a form of guidance that was impeccable. So the Imam, essentially, for the Shi'is, has to be someone who is divinely guided by God and does not make mistakes and so on. So if I can just sum up the two, I think the Sunnis see guidance as taking place through consensus in the community. God guides the community as a whole through the scholars and so on, and even though there's fallibility, there's a general idea that there's guidance taking place. For the Shi'is, guidance has to take place through the Imam, for this special person appointed by God. And the Shia traditions say that God appointed the Imams even from before the creation of Adam. So it really does kind of lead to differences about not only what the teachings are, what the authentic traditions are, but also what is the nature of leadership in the Muslim community? What is the ideal nature of leadership?
The other interesting thing you said at the beginning is that for most of history, Sunni and Shia have lived in peace with one another.
Yes.
And that toleration and respect of just letting each other do each other live and just be there.
Mm-hmm.
And yet today, one of the reasons why Westerners have come to know about this distinction through the news is that we think of these as the great fault lines, and we know of all of crises between Sunni and Shia.
Mm-hmm.
How did that move from toleration and live and let live to a more confrontational approach between the two forms occur?
I guess, mainly because of political changes and political events and the general crises in leadership and authority in the Muslim world that's taken place since the disintegration of major Muslim empires over the last few centuries. If we go back to the early the reasons why Sunnis and Shias could live together, one of the reasons they did was because there was a small group of breakaway Muslims who basically denounced everyone else who wasn't part of that group. They were known as the Khawarij, and they basically made it very, very difficult to be defined as a Muslim unless you lived according to a very, very high moral standard. And the majority of Muslims, whether Shia or Sunni, however they disagreed over the issue of leadership, basically agreed that membership of the Muslim community has to, strictly speaking, be defined based on profession of God's unity and the recognition of the Prophet Muhammad's prophecy, his nature as the last messenger to mankind. So as long as anyone sticks to those two principles, they're considered a Muslim. And differences of opinion don't have to lead to conflict and fighting. They can lead to debate and disagreement and so on. But essentially both traditions developed legal systems that basically recognize each other as fellow members, fellow Muslims, fellow worshippers of God, albeit with some major differences about the nature of authority and leadership.
So the current situation of thinking of Sunni and Shia as somehow equivalent to the great religious wars that occurred in Europe 300 or 400 years ago, this is a very recent phenomenon in Islam.
Yes, between Sunnis and Shias. I mean, there were battles between Shia and Sunni empires in the later medieval period, for example, between the Ottomans and the Safavids. But I would say actually the reasoning wasn't really theological so much as it was political. I mean, Ottomans fought against the Safavids, who were Shias, but they had Shias living in their territories. They didn't persecute them necessarily unless they were thought to be kind of a political threat. So it really does boil down to kind of politics at the end of the day. And there isn't, theology is often used as a justification after the fact of a political division or difference.
Yeah. Yes, and that's something, of course, that is not confined to Islam.
No, not at all.
Harith, thank you very much for coming along today.
Thank you.
And I know that it was an impossible task I set you, but I hope it does give our viewers an introduction to the whole, to this major division within Islam. Thank you.
Thank you.